Graduation day was supposed to feel like a victory lap, but for Caleb Brooks, it felt more like a quiet retreat. The sky above Ridgeway Technical Institute hung heavy with low gray clouds, matching the mood that sat in his chest like a weight. He sat alone in the cab of his beat-up blue pickup truck, the engine off, the heater barely keeping the damp air at bay. His graduation cap and gown were tossed unceremoniously onto the passenger seat, wrinkled and still speckled with raindrops. Beside them sat a fast food bag holding a cold taco combo he'd picked up from a drive-thru 2 blocks away, while cheers echoed from the gym behind him, where classmates posed for family photos and clutched congratulatory balloons. Caleb remained parked behind the maintenance shed, out of sight, just how he preferred it. He had sent 3 graduation invitations, knowing deep down none would be answered. His mother was somewhere between recovery centers, his father hadn't called in years, and the cousin he once lived with had ghosted him after a fight over rent. The silence had been expected, but it still cut deep. He'd walked the stage anyway, accepted his HVAC certificate with a stiff smile, and nodded at the few teachers who clapped a little louder when his name was called. But afterward, as the families clustered in celebration, no one waited for him. No one called his name. No one asked where he wanted to go for dinner. So he did what he'd become good at. He disappeared, out the side door, into his truck, away from the noise and the reminders. He sat in the stillness, chewing lukewarm food and watching the fog creep up the corners of his windshield. There was no music playing, no texts buzzing with congratulations, just the soft hum of the city and the dull ache of a milestone that felt more like a mirage as he stared at the folded paper in his lap, his diploma. Caleb wondered if all the sleepless nights, double shifts, and missed meals had been worth it. He had made it, yes, but it didn't feel like much of a triumph. Just then, a sudden knock on his window made him jump and changed everything. The sharp knock on Caleb's window jolted him from his daze, nearly making him spill the soda balanced precariously between his knees. He turned, expecting maybe a security guard telling him to move, or worse, a nosy classmate. But instead, standing in the drizzle with a paper bag in one hand and a work glove in the other, was Mr. Leo Ramirez, the school's longtime janitor. "Mind some company?" he asked casually, his tone light, like this was something they did every day. Caleb blinked, caught off guard. He barely knew Mr. Ramirez outside of a few polite nods in the hallway, but before he could even respond, the janitor was already walking around the truck to the passenger side. With a hesitant shrug, Caleb tossed his cap and gown into the back seat and shoved aside a stack of old workbooks and fast food wrappers to make space. "Sorry about the mess," he mumbled. Ramirez slid into the seat with a grunt, his navy coveralls slightly damp, the bag in his lap steaming with warmth. "Trust me," he said with a smirk. "I've seen worse. Ever looked behind the vending machines in the rec center?" That pulled a reluctant chuckle from Caleb. For a moment, neither of them said much. The engine ticked softly in the silence, the scent of seasoned beef and fresh bread escaping the bag. Mr. Ramirez reached inside and pulled out 2 warm empanadas, handing one to Caleb without a word. It was such a simple gesture, so unexpected, that Caleb didn't quite know how to react. But the warmth in his hand, and the warmth in the silence between them, felt more comforting than anything he'd experienced all day. As they ate in companionable silence, the soft rain tapping on the windshield, Mr. Ramirez leaned back in the seat with a contented sigh. "You know," he began, not looking at Caleb, but instead watching the hazy reflection of the school building through the fogged-up glass, "when I got my GED, I didn't have anyone waiting for me either." Caleb turned to him, curious despite himself. Ramirez continued, "I was 34, took night classes at a community center 3 towns over. Graduation was on a Thursday. No stage, no photos, just a counselor handing me a folded certificate and a pat on the back." He chuckled dryly. "I celebrated with a lukewarm burrito on a park bench and a flat soda from a vending machine. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Seriously? Ramirez nodded. Seriously, I dropped out at 16, took care of my younger brothers while my mom worked doubles, spent years doing odd jobs. But something about that paper, it made me feel like I'd earned back a piece of something I thought I lost. He glanced at Caleb. So, I get it, that hollow feeling after a big moment when there's no one around to clap. Caleb looked down at his hands, empanada half-eaten, suddenly unsure of what to say. You know what helped me most? Ramirez added, shifting slightly. Wasn't the diploma, wasn't even the job I landed later. It was one teacher, a guy who taught math at that night school, didn't owe me a thing, but he stayed late after class to help me prep for the final. Said I reminded him of his kid. We never talked much, but he showed up, and sometimes, he paused, that's everything. Caleb nodded slowly, the truth of those words settling deep. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he had to defend himself or explain. Mr. Ramirez wasn't offering pity, he was offering understanding, the kind you only get from someone who's been there too. Caleb stared out the windshield, the wipers long since stopped, leaving the drizzle to bead and blur the outside world. He hadn't expected to feel anything today, especially not seen, but Mr. Ramirez wasn't finished. You think nobody noticed, huh? The janitor said quietly, unwrapping another empanada and handing it to Caleb without waiting for a response. You think you just scraped through unnoticed, like some ghost drifting from one class to the next? Caleb gave a tired shrug. I mean, kinda. Ramirez chuckled, but it wasn't mocking. Well, you're wrong. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes sharp now. MS Patterson, in math? She told me last month she's never seen anyone calculate head pressure on so little sleep. She knew you were working those night shifts at that welding plant, and she still gave you a chance to retake the midterm after you fell asleep in class. Caleb blinked. She never said anything. She didn't need to, Ramirez replied. She just stayed late grading papers so you could use her room to study quietly. He continued, listing people Caleb had barely registered as allies. The welding instructor, Mr. Sims, who paid out of pocket for Caleb's steel tee boots when his wore out. The cafeteria lady, Miss Judy, who always made sure there was an extra sandwich in his lunch tray. Even the security guard, old Frank, who once let him nap in the staff lounge during winter break when he had nowhere else to go. Each name landed like a stone in Caleb's chest. Not out of shame, but realization. He'd been so consumed by the absence of his own family, he'd overlooked the small army of quiet advocates who had filled the gaps. People who had bent rules, stayed late, or looked the other way, not because they had to. I thought I was just getting lucky, Caleb said quietly, more to himself than to Ramirez. The janitor gave a soft laugh. There's no such thing as luck when it comes to survival, kid. There's only grit, grace, and the people who show up when you least expect it. Caleb leaned back against the seat, heart pounding. Maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been as alone. Just as Caleb was beginning to process the weight of everything Mr. Ramirez had said, the janitor shifted in his seat and reached into the inside pocket of his worn navy coveralls. Almost forgot, he said casually, pulling out a thick white envelope. This was supposed to be given to you at the reception, but since you didn't stick around, he handed it over without fanfare. Caleb hesitated, eyeing it warily before. Inside was a folded card, covered in handwritten messages. Caleb, you've made us proud. Your resilience is unmatched. We believe in your future. Dozens of signatures, teachers, aides, even the secretary, who printed his schedule every semester, had filled every blank space. But what stopped Caleb cold was what was clipped to the inside, a $250. His fingers trembled as he held the card. "What is this?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Ramirez smiled. "We all pitched in. Nothing fancy, but we figured books and tools don't pay for themselves, and a kid like you deserve a better start than a cold taco in a parking lot." Caleb swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He'd gotten used to doing everything himself, to never expecting anything from anyone. The idea that a group of people, most of whom he'd barely spoken to, had thought of him, planned this, cared this much, it was overwhelming. "I don't know what to say," he muttered, his voice cracking despite his best effort. Ramirez patted him on the shoulder. "You don't have to say anything. Just keep building. That's what matters." Caleb nodded slowly, blinking back emotion he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. As Caleb tucked the envelope carefully into the glove compartment, treating it like something fragile and sacred, Mr. Ramirez opened the truck door with a soft grunt. Rain still pattered on the roof, and the evening had started to dim into a pale, quiet gray. Before stepping out, the janitor paused and leaned back in, resting one arm casually on the open door. "By the way," he said, as if it were an afterthought, "a bunch of us from the faculty are grabbing burgers at Sal's Grill in about an hour. Nothing fancy, just a tradition after graduation." He shrugged, his tone easy, almost indifferent. "You don't have to come, but if you did feel like being around folks who'd like to see you, well, there's a seat waiting." Caleb looked over, startled. "You want me to come?" Ramirez gave him a look that landed somewhere between amused and sincere. "Kid, I wouldn't be standing in the rain if I didn't." Then, without waiting for a reply, he gave a small nod and shut the door behind him, heading off toward the gym's side entrance, disappearing into the drizzle. Caleb sat in the stillness, the warm card still on his lap, a quiet invitation lingering in the air. It wasn't a demand, it wasn't pity, it was simply a door left open. Caleb sat in the truck long after Mr. Ramirez had vanished from view, the interior filled with the scent of half-eaten food and the weight of his own thoughts. He stared at the now closed glove compartment where the envelope rested, his mind spiraling through memories he'd worked hard to keep buried. The night shifts at the metal fabrication shop where sparks flew like fireflies as he welded steel until his arms ached. The early mornings, walking into school with gritty eyes and hands still smelling of engine grease. The exhaustion that clung to him like a second skin. Falling asleep in the library during free periods. Skipping meals to afford rent for a room he lost 2 months later. He remembered sleeping in his truck through a bitter January, using his old hoodie as a blanket, and pretending the cold didn't bother him. He hadn't thought of himself as strong, just someone doing what he had to in order to survive. But now, framed by the quiet echo of Mr. Ramirez's words, he saw those moments in a different light. Each tired morning and every skipped lunch hadn't been signs of defeat. They were evidence of persistence, grit, maybe even worth. The stories Ramirez told, the names of teachers who had quietly supported him, they weren't just passing moments, they were the invisible threads that had kept him stitched together when everything else was falling apart. For the first time, Caleb began to understand that maybe survival wasn't just about pushing through alone. Maybe it was also about allowing yourself to recognize the hands that reached out when you were too tired to ask for help. He let out a shaky breath and leaned his head back against the seat. The ache in his chest wasn't just loneliness anymore. It was the slow, almost painful realization that he'd been valued all along, and that truth was beginning to change everything. The rain had slowed to a mist by the time Caleb started the truck. The soft rumble of the engine grounded him as he sat for a moment, staring through the windshield. He didn't have a plan, just a name and a place. Sal's Grill. The thought of walking into a room full of teachers outside of school hours without the armor of a desk or hope. He pulled out of the parking lot slowly, past the now empty gym where the last of the balloons were being tied to family car bumpers. He caught glimpses of classmates laughing with parents, siblings taking selfies, cars loaded with flowers and takeout boxes. There was a time when those scenes would have pierced him with envy so sharp it felt like shame. But tonight, they didn't cut as deep. Instead, he found himself wondering what struggles hid behind those perfect pictures. Not every smile was whole, not every family complete, and maybe, just maybe, his path, though lonelier, was no less valid. He turned down Maple Street and headed towards Sowell's, the glow of the diner's neon sign flickering faintly in the mist ahead. The closer he got, the more his chest tightened, but so did his resolve. He didn't know what would happen when he walked through that door, but for the first time in a long time, Caleb wasn't driving away from something. He was driving toward it, not because he was invited and that was enough for now. Caleb pulled into the lot of Sal's Grill and immediately regretted it, twice. His first instinct was to turn around, to disappear before anyone noticed. But as he sat gripping the steering wheel, trying to will his feet to move, the front door of the diner swung open. Standing there, waving through the warm yellow light, was Miss Patterson. His former math teacher, her usual stern expression, replaced by a wide, genuine smile. She didn't call attention to him or make a scene. She simply waved, as if greeting an old friend, then casually held the door open, chatting with Coach Franklin like nothing was out of the ordinary. That simple gesture, subtle, kind, gave Caleb the push he needed. He stepped out of his truck slowly, tucking his graduation cap under his arm like a shield. The moment his boots hit the wet pavement, a breeze caught his jacket, reminding him how exposed he felt. But as he approached the entrance, the nerves started to fade. Coach Franklin gave him a nod, the kind that said, "Good to see you." Inside, he spotted familiar faces. Miss Reeves stirring her iced tea, Mr. Sims laughing over something with the school nurse, Miss Judy already unwrapping a foil-covered platter of her famous brownies. No one stared, no one acted surprised. It was like he belonged there all along. Caleb crossed the threshold, and for the first time that day, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt included. Not because someone had to let him in, but because people wanted him there. And that quiet acceptance, more than applause or staged photos, was the moment that finally made graduation real. The inside of Sal's Grill buzzed with warm chatter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of a jukebox playing an old classic rock tune. The scent of grilled burgers and fresh-cut fries wrapped around Caleb like a blanket as he eased into a booth at the edge of the group. Miss Reeves scooted over to make room and handed him a laminated menu like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're just in time. They're out of onion rings, but the chili's still hot," she said with a wink. Caleb managed a smile, still half in disbelief that he was here, surrounded not by strangers, but by people who'd quietly become a part of his survival story. The conversation flowed easily. Coach Franklin cracked jokes about his ancient truck that needed more tape than gas to stay running. Ms. Patterson asked about his plans for community college, genuinely interested. Miss Judy told him she'd saved him a slice of pie and dared him to say no. No one brought up his absence from the ceremony reception. No one treated him like a charity case or a tragedy. They talked to him like he belonged, like he had always belonged. As the night went on, laughter echoed off the diner's tiled walls, and Caleb felt something inside him loosen, a tight knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for years. He had no snapshots from this graduation day, no family photos, no father's proud handshake or mother's tearful hug, but he had this, a table of people who'd shown up without cameras, without obligation, just because they cared. And in that moment, surrounded by coffee cups, shared fries, and small but sincere gestures, Caleb realized he didn't need the family he was born into to feel whole. He had found a new kind of family, a chosen one, stitched together by quiet kindness, steady presence, and unwavering belief. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't picture perfect, but it was real, and that finally was enough. Later that night, Caleb sat in the cab of his truck once more, parked outside his small apartment complex under a flickering street lamp. The hum of the engine had gone quiet, replaced by a stillness that didn't feel as heavy as before. He reached over and opened the glove compartment, pulling out the envelope Mr. Ramirez had given him. The card, now slightly creased from being handled too carefully, he read the messages again, each one a thread in the quiet tapestry of support he hadn't realized had been holding him together all along. Slowly, almost ceremoniously, he placed the card back inside and closed the compartment with care, as if sealing a chapter. Looking up at his reflection in the rearview mirror, Caleb studied the tired eyes staring back. They were the same eyes that had faced eviction notices, sleepless shifts, and silent birthdays, but tonight they looked different. Not because the struggle was over, but because something had shifted inside him. A spark, a sense of worth that didn't come from applause or approval, but from the realization that he mattered to people who had nothing to gain by showing up and did anyway. As he turned off the ignition and stepped out into the cool night air, Caleb didn't feel like the kid who'd eaten alone in a parking lot. He felt like a graduate, a survivor, a young man with roots in unexpected places and reasons to keep growing. And as he walked toward the stairwell, he thought about Mr. Ramirez's parting words. Just make sure it wasn't wasted on you. Caleb smiled to himself, hand still resting over his jacket pocket, like it protected something sacred. It won't be, he whispered. Then he climbed the steps, not just to his door, but into whatever came next. Sometimes the loudest celebrations aren't the ones that matter most. Caleb's story reminds us that while not everyone has a picture-perfect support system, there are often quiet heroes in the background, people who show up, care deeply, and believe in us when we can't believe in ourselves. Whether it's a janitor with a warm meal, a teacher who stays late, or a cafeteria worker who packs a little extra, this story teaches us that family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who show up. And more importantly, it's about letting yourself recognize and receive that support when it comes. Because being seen, truly seen, can transform loneliness into hope and hardship into pride. So if you've ever felt invisible, just remember, someone out there is watching, and your effort does matter. You're not as alone as you think. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Help us continue telling stories that shine a light on resilience, connection, and the power of showing up.